First off, I want to apologize to anyone watching these videos because they end up being a little more slideshow than I'd like them to be. Digital copyright law is kind of in a weird space at the turn of the millennium here. And I don't think YouTube's automatic implementation is all that effective in determining fair use, especially in this type of transformative critical work that we're doing here, but that's neither here nor there. So before we move on to the aftermath of the duel, I kind of want to return to a line that we glanced over last time, or didn't really talk about, and really use it as a springboard for a bigger discussion about Utena as a whole. Here's the line.
What's this? You're a girl?
I never said that I was a boy!
Now, I think overall Rachel Lillis is an amazingly expressive and emotive Utena, and her English voice acting is one of the many reasons I love the series. But this line in general is just the worst delivery I've heard. Ooh. And doesn't everything else kind of strike you as corny too about that, of just the delivery of that, of Seonji's reaction, and that it's supposed to be this huge, triumph here that she's, got some titties on her, and she's able to fight against the big bad guys. I want to use this line, though, to break through and kind of start the discussion about feminism and Revolutionary Girl Utena and how it's used, and how I think most people who view the series kind of misinterpret it. I don't claim to be a scholar of feminism or gender roles or anything like that, but I do lay a claim to knowing a bit about Ikehara and what he's trying to do in this series and in this film. And I have watched a good deal of very feminine anime, and a lot that uses femininity as more than we would come to expect. I see three distinct levels to a feminist reading of Revolutionary Girl Utena. The first is what I like to call kind of the simple transgressive thing. There's an established patriarchy with the idea of the prince, the roses, the swords, Otri Academy in general. And then, in the first episode of Revolutionary Girl Utena, or in, the movie as well here with I Never Said I Was a Boy, you see Utena violate that. She dunks on the male basketball players, or she fights the men in their duel with their sword. And this is kind of the appropriation level of feminism, that the women are taking on the male characteristics, and I guess you could say Mickey takes on sort of feminine characteristics as well, and we kind of attack or lampshade or subvert the common ideas of gender performance as we know them in general. It's something that gets a lot more play during the course of the series, where you see Akio and Toga kind of force Utena back into that role, or try and use her gender and her femininity as a way to attack her, or put her back in her place. And I think a lot of people champion anything that would directly destroy that or challenge that. And it gets a lot of play in the LGBTQ type of communities, or people looking to read the show in that way. But I think if Revolutionary Girl Utena were just trying to do that alone, or it stopped here, it would not be an interesting or engaging series. It's kind of just presenting something antithetical to what the normal social structure is. Girls can kick ass too is a fine sentiment and one I support, but it's not inherently nuanced, I suppose. And this just isn't limited to the feminism in Utena. I generally have a problem with anyone who kind of stops at the content of the show and says that's enough, without looking any further into the subtext or trying to divine any meaning from a work of art. But here's the thing, does this transgression against the established gender norms really amount to much of anything? It surely allows Utena to participate in kind of the male-dominated duels, and in that regard it's kind of a result of her high goals that she set for herself earlier, and her desire to play the prince, or be the person that the idea of the prince would want her to be. But doesn't Juri transgress upon these gender performance roles in the same way that Utena does? And Juri doesn't get to escape Otri Academy. In fact, she's in the Wakaba Jeep at the end with the others stating, "Go on ahead, we'll get there soon." I think if just breaking down these gender roles and these established, buckets that people have to fall in was enough to avail Utena, Anthe, or anyone of the problems that plague them, or the real issues at hand, then they would just go do that. It would simply be just realizing that Utena has these high goals and that she doesn't need to be burdened by anyone who only thinks men can only do things, and that would be kind of be it. It would be this kind of simplistic feminist manifesto of fuck the haters, right? But that's not what happens at all. As we pointed out in the previous video, Utena only wins the duel because her compassionate words towards Anthe and her seeing her as a person instead of a prize to be won reached Anthe and caused Anthe to act. She doesn't win the duel by virtue of being a girl and holding a sword. And we'll see over the course of the rest of the show that simple compassion and understanding and being honest with yourself is what really makes the progress go forward. In that way, I think it's very much a feminine value rather than a female performing or assuming or appropriating a male role that allows the characters to make progress. Indeed, what's more feminist? Buying into the male patriarchal power structure of the duels and the conflicts and violence and showing that women can do conflicts and violence better than the men? Or is it the knowledge that you don't have to play by those rules and can establish your own values? And I think this is really that second level of feminism or understanding or reading Utena as an empowering piece, not only to women, but to anyone beholden to these established roles by the social hierarchy. In fact, I would go so far as to say Revolutionary Girl Utena presents that first level reading of kind of buying into the established system and fighting against it from within as the red herring of an answer. Because it kind of runs parallel to the appreciation that Utena shows for Anthe and their bond growing, and because of that we do see some nominal success in winning the duels. It seems very easy and almost intentional on how Utena, Anthe, and the viewers could really conflate these ideas and see their transgression as the correct path and the thing that's going to solve their problems. Throw another checkmark on the side of Ikehara being a genius and having this all planned out. And by the same vein, I don't blame the characters or anyone consuming this text for grasping onto that and kind of considering that as the most valuable thing that the show has to offer. We're very much still in a time socially where we need that confirmation. But I think you do this movie and this series a disservice if you only stop there and don't receive the full message Ikehara was intending to send. I really want you to have that dichotomy in mind between buying into the system and trying to change it and outright rejecting it as we go further into the adolescence of Utena and try and figure out why Anthe behaves the way she does. Before we do that though, I want to wrap up the kind of third level of how I see Revolutionary Girl Utena as a feminist work. To recap, I see that first layer as stealing or assuming or transgressing into a male-dominated space and male-dominated roles in the patriarchy and kind of trying to take it and then operate from within it or attack it from within. It's your girls can be princes too idea. Then you've got this second layer that we've just started to see, and that's opening up to each other and compassion and understanding, and Utena and Anthe forming these bonds in these traditional female ways and granting that power and legitimacy. Maybe fighting the patriarchy from without. Or put simply, it's the idea that it's just as valuable to be the princess. The way I think of the third and final one is kind of the ending of Scott Pilgrim versus the World, the movie version, where he goes in and he's the power of revenge and he gets destroyed, and then it's the power of love and he gets destroyed, and then it's the power of self-actualization and he's able to overcome the evil with that. And I think it's directly tied into the large theme of the film, Adolescence of Utena that is, that's never really talked about too much inside the film itself, but is talked about all the time within the film itself, of adolescence. It's very much a time where you decide your own values, you come to understand more about yourself and what you're going to put your effort into and why. And I think the third layer of feminism, or the feminist reading here, that admittedly is no more correct or better or tied up in the other two in kind of an inseparable mess, is that you don't need to fight the fight at all. You only need to save yourself and help others. And this is something a lot larger that we want to keep in the back of our minds, I think, for later on in the film, but the structure of Otri Academy, the structure of the patriarchy that it represents, it all kind of hinges on the acceptance of the people within it buying into it, and that's the only thing that gives it legitimacy or power. And any negative or oppressive social structure like that, it's tempting, right, to want to fight against it, to bring it down. And it's so tempting to take it as its gestalt and point out its inequities and really say, this collective thing, this social structure, these attitudes are are harming us, and we want to destroy it as its collective, as if it's, you know, Die Buster and there's an alien species invading with lasers. But I love this film because it's not that. The solution's not that simple. And even the feminine values, or even the females performing the male values, aren't enough to take down Otri Academy. But the self-actualization of the heroines is. Or maybe that's overly optimistic. Utena and Anthony don't destroy Otri Academy, they just leave it. But their solution, and the feminist reading that I find the best, and that this show indeed supports, is the women finding the strength to check out of the social pressures that they're under. Not attacking, not destroying, not replacing, not fighting, just going to live their own life. And like I said, I think that the show explicitly uses the other two as kind of a befuddlement or even a hoodwink at times to kind of draw the viewer's attention away from the ultimate answer there. That's probably 11 minutes too much about one little throwaway line. But this exact confusion in priorities and objectives is really what this whole next part of the story is going to be about, with Anthony and Utena kind of feeling themselves out and figuring out how they're going to act around each other, what really drew them to each other, and what they can find in each other that will allow them to achieve the actualization that they need to escape this social structure and this academy. Transition of the bubbles coming up in a boy's shoe. You know, your second watch through, it's not very subtle, but your first watch through, you're kind of like, what's going on? It's still cool as hell, though. I like this framing shot because we've talked about high up and low down and kind of, you know, what those represent. And this is pretty low. This isn't a highfalutin thing. This is what I like to call a moment of grace, or a part where characters can interact outside of the assumed fantasy of the world and the plot. Man, talk about shot composition here. On the inside of her wardrobe, we just had the bit about her being a girl, and we see dresses and skirts, and what's more, her filling it with books, which would represent knowledge. And finally, a picture of Toga, which very confusing coming from the series, but you know is a great representation of Utena holding the memory of Toga within her, because the wardrobe, the girly things, the knowledge, it's all within her. And a nice cut to just the outside now. We're not seeing any of what's in the wardrobe and her sad face. The memories of Toga aren't exposed to the outside world. When somebody asks you what good directing looks like, just point them to this type of scene or link them directly to this, you know, timestamp in this video. When the thing that's going on within the character is displayed on screen using visual metaphor, and the idea is conveyed without any words to the viewer, that's damn good directing. Add in the fact that she places it higher and then it looks down on her in this angle of this shot. Just shows the power that the idea has over her, or the power that she lets it have over her by giving it so much weight. I think the next shot is specifically structured in a way to show that light on the left there. I'm not entirely sure why the high angle remains. Maybe it's to imply that Toga's looking down and watching this, which we'll see in later scenes. Now, if we read the closet and the wardrobe as the inner Utena, I suppose that we can read the bedroom as the kind of outer-facing Utena, which Anthony just casually and probably very rudely barges in on. Obviously, you've got the big change in her personality from the series, and a lot of what the show's going through right now is contrasting the knowledge that the viewer has of the original series and the characters there with the knowledge of the characters right now. So Anthony's comment here can kind of be read as, you know, the contrast between the Utena in the series, who's kind of freewheeling and laissez-faire, with this Utena, who's very tight, very reserved, very straight and narrow. Hell, you can even see it in her character design. She really doesn't have any curves, which goes along with the whole gender and the whole thing of her breasts being exposed when she finds out she's a girl, and that being kind of something that she closets off away from the rest of the world. I also like the way sheets are drawn in this movie, and if I were feeling a little more adventurous, I would equate the pink sheets here to the folds of a labia. Might be a stretch, but there's a heavy sexuality in this next scene. Utena grabbing Anthe before she can leave always struck me as kind of weird. I mean, for the contexts of the relationship and what happened, you know, Utena valuing Anthe at the duel kind of led this, and, you know, in the subtext of the show, Anthe staying here and Utena getting to know her a little bit bit more makes sense. However, this action kind of feels out of place for the very reserved Utena. I think, though, the way that I like to look at this is due to her corny line of "silly, I'm not going to let you go home tonight." That's so male. Or like this weird bravado that Utena normally wouldn't show, or doesn't feel inherent to Utena, either the Utena that we know or the reserved Utena from the movie. And the very obvious in-your-face symbolism of the lights changing color and turning off and going blue. Ikehara loves to do stuff like that to kind of point out when he's doing something a little bit weird with what's going on in the scene. Taken all together, I can kind of read this action by Utena as a performance, or assuming the role that she believes that she should play to be the prince. Maybe this is what she thinks Toga would do, or what she thinks Toga would like to do. But I do think that's why the lighting changes. This isn't true Utena. Anthe, however, responds very well to the act of bravado. It's clear that she has been here many times before, and this is very natural. Not to her specifically, because I don't think that's who Anthe is deep down inside, but to who Anthe has been conditioned to become by the society, by how she grew up, by Otari Academy and the life that she's forced to lead. For what it's worth, I think both the voice actresses in both the English and the Japanese really sell the difference between Utena's lines and Anthe's, well, let's say her willingness. And now this very next shot, do you remember where you've seen this shot before? Do you have an idea? That's right, the final shot of the film. The Utena and Anthe riding together on the remains of the car out in the wilderness. But what's the difference there? In that shot, they're moving, they're heading up, and they're completely naked. And it's colorful and vibrant. It's the same sexuality, but in this scene, it's a performance. By both of them, it's a learned behavior. And that makes it awkward. It makes it dull. It makes it stagnant. But there's no doubt that it's sex. And when Utena rejects it, the lights come back on, because that's the true Utena. But this is very interesting. Anthe smiles at the rejection. Naturally, she doesn't want to perform that role that's been assigned to her as the Rose Bride. But here's the wild thing, it doesn't end here. What's the next thing Anthe does? Pries into her wardrobe. The very thing that we've associated with Utena's femininity. The very thing that she's locked away. Anthe goes in on the fabrication that Utena has put up and attempts to pry it apart and get in behind it into the real Utena. I think that action, more so than the physical contact, is what Utena deems as weird. But then the slow zoom in on the picture of Utena and Toga really shows that Anthe has broken in there and now knows about that. Or the reason she opened the wardrobe was to find that. It was very important for the pool cleaning scene that'll happen later. Why is Anthe doing that? She goes out of her way to dig up dirt or expose Utena's true self. Is it malicious? Is she trying to gain an advantage over her? Or does she want to push Utena into something to help her better understand what it is that's holding her back? I don't think Anthe has that kind of awareness at this point, but she's certainly acting with intent in this scene. Note Toga's line of "she's weird" and how it comes in before the scene shifts. It's a wonderful directing technique, and I've seen Ikehara use it. What it does is kind of marries the two things together. Toga's talking about one thing, but what he's talking about is applying to what we just saw. The previous zoom-in shot from Anthe's point of view has let us know that she knows Utena's secret about why she wants to be the prince. Then when Toga says she's weird, that applies not only to what Utena thought of Anthe, but also what Toga thinks of Utena. And I think that ties into a lot of what's said in this scene and the exposition here. But before we go on, I want to point out that "she's weird" was what was said by Utena, and then echoed by Toga. We said in our previous episodes, and we know from seeing the film already, that Toga does not exist. He never reached adulthood. Utena's perception of Toga thinks things. And here in this scene, we kind of see that Shiori has her own perception of Toga that kind of matches up with Utena, and really her own perception of what a prince should be. So much like earlier, I kind of go back to struggling to understand what Toga is intending or how Toga's operating. He's not an actor in this story. He's only a manifestation of Utena and the concept of the prince that she holds dear. When Utena says Anthe's weird for, prying into her and trying to find out more about her and breaking through into her wardrobe and getting past that surface level, does Utena herself think she's weird, or does Utena's perception of the prince think that she should say that Anthe is weird for that action? Much like earlier, is this a role that Utena's performing, or does she actually feel that way? I think the lights are on, and the voice actor's delivery of the line makes it seem like it is Utena saying this, but I don't think that does justice to kind of the entanglement of Utena's perception of the prince and her honest feelings. So for the Shiori and Toga scenes, I've read somewhere one time a wonderful breakdown of all the symbolism and everything about it, but for the life of me I can't find it again. And it's more the pity too, because it had some great stuff that I simply just don't remember anymore. The one thing I do remember is that Toga is shown here with a sheet over his face, and that's signifying a dead person. Like, obviously, like, oh my god, right? But I had never thought about it before I read that post. And the sheets themselves are a larger thing of kind of unraveling what's going on, and this is exposition here that Shiori's giving about the backstory of what we know to be Toga. The clean white sheets symbolizing the purity that everybody is associating with this concept that maybe really isn't there at all. Their banner back and forth kind of casually confirms the stuff we've been talking about of, you know, she's probably still dreaming of the castle with the prince, and, you know, that's everything we're going to talk about and have been talking about. Shiori also brings up how she's manipulating Juri into being beholden to the idea of the prince. The last notable thing that I can really point out is this hellscape painting with Anthe in the mountaintops. It's cracked and old, which probably means it hasn't been used or maintained. But I don't really understand why Anthe is in this scene, or why she's inserted into the scene via that painting. Anthe really has nothing to do with Shiori outside of the movie tape that she supplies later. I think it is implied that her blowing kind of reveals this painting, and that combined with its condition could maybe mean that she's discovering the painting, and that's kind of what clues her into what happened to Akio. I'm not entirely sold on that reading, so if you have a better one, let me know. But for right now, that's how I'm going to take it. Maybe something else will pop up as we go through the rest of the movie. Another bubble and shoe transition, we've got the pool cleaning scene. I like to look at the next segment of the film as sort of a montage of the issues that the characters are dealing with. More specifically, what exactly it is that is keeping each of the characters stuck in their idea of the prince and stuck in Otori Academy. So everything from about here to the climax of the Rose Garden scene is kind of viewed in that same light. Everything from Mickey in the tub, you know, Juri's thing with Shiori, and most prominently, Utena's history with Toga. The setting obviously water inspired, very blue, and every time water comes up, it's going to draw Utena's mind back to Toga. And much like the earlier scene with Toga, we have to think everything that Toga says in this scene is going to be a reflection of what Utena believed that a grown-up Toga who embodies the values of the prince would say to her. It is still, in effect, Utena talking with herself and her demons. And with her first line, Utena shows how disappointed she is with the fact that the prince would necessarily be buying into the idea of the duels, and the person she admired in Toga and can't get over would necessarily be the kind of embodiment of this destructive, patriarchal, really pernicious and pervading culture. Of course, Toga doesn't give a concrete answer, just like he didn't earlier in the film. It's all Utena's realization of it. And I think Toga in this scene is actually not maybe as bad for Utena as she might come to believe, because it's Utena's way of working out the way the world works, or breaking through her naivete to see, or maybe not to see, but finally acknowledge and understand that this is the setup culture that she is buying into by attempting to play the prince. Toga says so matter-of-factly, of course she'll spend the night with whoever wins the duel. That's really just Utena grappling with the reality of the situation, and it ties into her adolescence and the sexuality that we saw earlier. Utena is led to believe that that type of sexuality is what makes a grown-up, or what makes, or what a prince would be fighting for, that and that alone. And her internal value structure doesn't align with that, and it says that a prince should have loftier goals, or be fighting for more than that. And that largely informs the interaction in the second part of the scene. However, what's really notable, Anthe directly responds to Toga. Now, either our earlier reading of Toga being from within Utena is completely out of whack, or there's something else going on here that's kind of happening metaphorically. We could say that maybe this Anthe is a figment of Utena's imagination in much the same way. though there's not really anything to support that. So I'm much more inclined to see Anthe as being let in on the secret of Toga, because if you'll remember in this scene earlier, she saw the picture of Toga and Utena within Utena's inner closet. I think what's going on here metaphorically is that Anthe has kind of gotten in on Utena, or discovered her skeleton in her closet, quite almost literally, right? And she's taken that, and now she's kind of manipulating Utena with that. Or rather, let's say, Utena has to deal with the fact that Anthe knows now. How would Toga, the embodiment of the prince, react to the situation of the duels and Anthe? Her being coy and demure and sexy here is really provoking Utena. But wait, the shot of all the other girls that are cleaning the pool, as they fade out to reveal that there's nothing really there, aside from the rose. Maybe that's a big hint that this is kind of all intangible or metaphorical or not to be taken literally. I like it. I like it because Utena's confused about what the prince's role is supposed to be and how she's supposed to act when she's putting on those airs. In this nightmare of hers, she kind of imagines how the prince, Toga, would react favorably to Anthe. That's that portrayal of messed up sexuality that she wasn't able to act out. To play the prince in this role, she'll have to become like Toga is to Anthe. We've seen already that's not who she is. And it puts so much pressure on her to be that. And this nightmare weight of the societal pressures forcing her to be someone that's untrue to herself, that's what's going to propel her into the climax. This scene is her perception, and because it's so warped and messed up, it's why she breaks down and cries. For the next 10 minutes of the film, we don't see Utena, and the effect of that is to imply she's alone, she's mopey, sullen, or brooding about this. She's off dealing with what just happened for an eighth of the film that is about her, and she certainly doesn't come back with it worked out. This scene is Utena falling apart. So that kind of brings up the question of why would Anthe play into this? Why would she go along with this? And why would she be a willing participant in the misogyny, I don't know, what do you want to call it, of the prince? Well, we're kind of in luck because the very next line is Akio explaining just that. All of these characters are struggling to deal with, their idea of the prince, and being unable to get past it, that's kind of imprisoning the idea of the prince, right? It's keeping a value, keeping it locked away, being unable to let it go. The ultimate catch-22 is that it doesn't mean anything unless you believe in it. We've seen and we're going to see a lot of why Shiori, why Juri, why Mickey, why Utena can't let it go. But Akio here is asking us to think about why Anthe does the same thing. Why she can't move past O3 Academy. Akio doesn't know. Maybe because he's dead. We also get some kind of confirmation here that the pictures are the past or ideas that are hidden away or really a different story. Don't want to go overly hard on the analysis here because I don't feel that I understand everything nearly as well as I would like. Shiori's nail polish. I don't really understand what it is, save for the fact that it matches Toga's hair and he applies it to her feet, which I kind of just take as Shiori's idea of what Toga would be or what the prince would be to her. And her desire to lord over people or have them be subservient to her kind of shows up later in her interactions with Juri. Anthe, though, I feel a little bit better about. First is the general tone of the piece. Ikuhara loves to do this, of put the society or the establishment or kind of the social pressures at large against the inner conflicts of the characters. You have that whole Japanese or East Asian thing where it's kind of really oppressive, the culture that they live in, and people that are kind of avant-garde or outside of that culture are pressured to conform, and that shows up again and again in all of Ikuhara's works. And it's usually always demonized. It's important to recognize that the social pressures are what cause Anthe to end up in the state where she's in, i.e. trapped in O3 Academy, trapped in the idea of needing a prince. How much weight we're supposed to put in the fact that she has magical powers, I'm not really sure. It could allude to the power to revolutionize the world, that is, the power to leave O3 Academy behind and grow up and become a whole person. It could allude to the preeminent power of compassion and understanding apparent in Anthe that we'll see later on. I like this because it fits thematically and gives us a reason for why the mob would hate Anthe. In so many of Ikuhara's works, that's the thing that the society wants to repress and keep down. And if we go by the end of the scene, when Toga says that's what he wants to gain in the end, and he's talking to Akio about that's what he set up the game to obtain, that kind of fits in well with the power to revolutionize the world and what we know of the series and what the nominal goal is. If that's the case, we can read the falsification of Dios by Anthe as sort of an extension of her using this power. Likely with positive intent and with purity and compassion and understanding, she created something. That something is described in the metaphor as Dios. This is the first time we've seen Dios in the film, but we should know him from the series, right? He's kind of this clandestine, sacrosanct idea of the true prince, or being good to everyone, or compassion and understanding manifest in the concept of the prince. Whereas everyone else has their false ideas of what the prince is, or their mistaken stand-in princes, Dios was always kind of that tuxedo mask perfect person, right? The ultimately unattainable idea of the prince on the white horse, who can do no wrong. But the key word there is unobtainable. Dios can't exist. He never could exist. He's an idea born of the purity of somebody's soul. But his perfection means that he can never be applied to a real person. In creating this something magnificent, something innocent, something true, Anthe intended to create a beacon of light for the world and showcase these ideas of how we can improve the society. The prince is someone we should aspire to be, and we should act in that way. It's much like religion, I think. But the society that Anthe was in and the society that Ikehara believes exists, well, it wouldn't necessarily react negatively to that. And what's more, by setting up this concept of the prince, she's accidentally established the idea that men need to be this unattainable thing, and it's kind of influenced the toxic masculinity if you see all the men striving to achieve that, and Utena striving to imitate that because she thinks she needs to. Also that they can get at Anthe's power. That is, the power to revolutionize the world, right? The power to affect change. The last thing to talk about here is the very direct reference to The Lord of the Flies. If you're not familiar, it's a book with large themes about, social structures and pressures and the desire for power. However, that anonymous Lord of the Flies is in fact a pig's head with a bunch of flies around it that the character believes speaks to him. On one level, it's very clearly setting up the idea that behind the white purity of Dios, and that idea that Anthe had constructed was this kind of nefarious, ugly reality, and that's what the characters are acting out by pretending to be the prince and believing in the prince. It's also this big revelation in the show. What the Lord of the Flies says to the boy who confronts it is that the boys, are the beast. The beast is internal and, societal. In much the same way, the beast in the Lord of the Flies book is instead the prince in Utena, and it's not anything that you could hunt and kill. It's not a real entity, much like Dios isn't a real thing, but is instead inside of them all. It's simultaneously a societal ill and a very personal one that people impose on themselves simply by buying into it and believing that it exists. Frankly, it's about as good of a reference as you could possibly imagine for this situation. The next segue is going to be into showing us how these characters in the show are, beholden to the idea of the prince and how it manifests for them. But we've been going for a while, so let's call it here, and we'll get to the next part of the film, including the best scene in all of anime, in the next video.